Welcome to Regionally Speaking, a forum that explores the distinctive aspects of Northeast Ohio's Western Reserve. And now, introducing your host, Professor of American Studies and the Director of the Western Reserve Studies Symposium at Case Western Reserve University, Gladys Haddad.
Hello and welcome to Regionally Speaking. It is our privilege today to have as our guest on our campus celebrating Martin Luther King Week, Father Roy Bourgeois. He has a very interesting story that we're going to share with you, and I'm going to begin by asking him to do that. Father Roy has a background that only he can explain to you about how he became such an activist and the ways in which he implemented that activism of his. Father Roy, please.
Well, first, it's a joy, an honor to be with you. We are all, products of our experiences and backgrounds. First, let me say, I don't know what can be more important than working for peace and struggling for justice in our world today. But I must admit that it took me quite a while to get on that road to peace. And in that struggle for justice, coming out of a small town in Louisiana, we didn't question our country's foreign policy or our church's teachings. Very traditional background, working class family, went to the state university, got a degree in geology. And when I left college, I entered the military, became a naval officer, thought of making the military a career. And in my fourth year, volunteered for shore duty in Vietnam. And that experience really was a turning point in my life. I, like so many, went to Vietnam believing the cause was noble. We bought into that big lie, that we were going to be the liberators. Same language used to justify the invasion of Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. But I came to the conclusion, really, that we're not made for war. We can't go about the business of killing and go on with our lives as before. And losing friends there, wounded there, really seeing so much suffering and death among the Vietnamese people, the civilians. They're always the majority of the casualties. And I came back wanting to be a peacemaker. I entered the Maryknoll community. I wanted to be a Catholic priest. My faith became very much more important to me in Vietnam. And I entered the Maryknoll community, was later ordained a Catholic priest, and went to serve the poor in Bolivia. And this became my home for the next 5 years, this slum on the outskirts of La Paz. And it was here where the poor became my teachers. They really educated me about my country's foreign policy. And I came home from there, not of my own free will. In my fifth year, I was arrested for speaking out with the poor against this brutal dictator that ran the country. And, of course, U.S. foreign policy, our country, that supported this dictator. And when I came home, it was a difficult time, but it was really, there was something that happened with a connection to Cleveland. There were 4 churchwomen killed in El Salvador.
Yes.
I did not know Jean Donovan. I did not know Dorothy Kazel, an Ursuline nun, or the lay missioner Jean Donovan. I did know, and they were friends, the other 2 women, Maura Clark and Ida Ford of the Maryknoll community. Yes. But when they were killed in El Salvador, it really brought me and many of us to El Salvador to ask what's going on here. Yeah. And when we went there, let me just say what we found was the slaughter of the innocents. Once again, we found our country, the United States, giving guns and training to soldiers at war with their people. And I'm sure we want to talk more about Jean Donovan and the churchwomen because, like Bishop Oscar Romero, who was assassinated just months before them, and like Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, these great prophets, these women touched us in such a deep way. I know they touched my life very deeply and really got me very involved in the struggle for peace and justice in El Salvador. Their death really challenged us to break our silence.
Oh, that's a wonderful way for me to introduce and and tell our listening audience that we at Case Western Reserve are sponsoring a Jean Donovan, who you just mentioned, Jean Donovan International Social Justice Conference on February 25th and Saturday, February 26th. And as you have indicated, while you did not know her, we knew her very well, those of us who are Cleveland residents, and her story is one that has always moved us. And it sounds to me as though it also moved you. Now I'd like to have you talk a little bit more, well, actually a lot more, about your work with, now I want to make sure I say this correctly, School of the Americas Watch. All right?
Well, I was introduced to this school in large part because of the churchwomen, Bishop Romero. There were so many people being killed in El Salvador. When I went there, I and others returned from that country back to our country, the United States, and we could not keep quiet. I mean, I had never seen anything like El Salvador, the violence toward the poor, such powerlessness, such suffering, such just brutality of the military that we were arming and training. And we spoke out, but we could not stop the violence. In 1989, November the 16th, they went after the Jesuits. They ran their university. This was years after Bishop Romero was assassinated, the 4 churchwomen, and many others. They were very upset with the Jesuits because they were speaking the truth. They were calling it by its right name, idolatry, and also condemning U.S. military aid and training to the Salvadoran military. The military of El Salvador entered the university campus of the Jesuits that November of 89, dragged these 6 Jesuits out of their rooms with them, their 2 women co-workers, a young mother and her teenage daughter, and they were massacred. A congressional task force, I must say, this made the front pages of newspapers all over the world. The Jesuits, as you know, have many universities, John Carroll, and yes. 28 other universities around the country. And it really upset a lot of people. And they sent a congressional task force to investigate. And this congressional task force from Washington returned reporting that those responsible were trained at the U.S. Army School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia. That's when I got Maryknoll's blessing. I was working at this time in Chicago with Maryknoll and went down to Georgia with a small group. I called friends, let's go down to investigate this U.S. Army School of the Americas. And it was very much in the news because it reported that those responsible for this recent massacre in El Salvador were trained here. Yes. We went down. I'm sorry.
Yes, I wanted to ask you the title, the name of the school, the U.S. School.
The U.S. Army School of the Americas, and it's located at Fort Benning, Georgia. For years, it started in Panama.
Yes.
But it was kicked out of Panama in 1983, referred to there, as many in Latin America, as a school of assassins, a school for dictators, for which it was. But we didn't find out about this school that had been operating for a few years at Fort Benning until after Bishop Romero, the Jesuits, the churchwomen were killed. We did our research, and what we found, I must say, was very alarming. This school, all paid for by the U.S. taxpayer, was training over 1,000 soldiers from 16 countries in Latin America, most from El Salvador. They came here to learn commando operations, psychological warfare, and we discovered in the curriculum were manuals that advocated torture. That really was exposed in the Washington Post, New York Times. But when the United Nations Truth Commission report came out, it got a lot of press shortly after we began the SOA Watch movement. They documented, the United Nations, that those who killed Bishop Romero trained at the School of the Americas at Fort Benning. Those who killed, who were responsible for raping and killing the 4 U.S. churchwomen, Jean Donovan, Dorothy Kazel, Maura Clark and Ida Ford. Those responsible for this were trained at this school. And among the Jesuits and the two women later, of the 28, 19 of them were graduates. So we went to work, putting the word out, let's call for the closing of the school. Let's gather at the main gate to keep alive the memory of the churchwomen, the Jesuits, the thousands of landless farmers there who were being killed, university students. And we started really with a small group of 10. That was 20 years ago. And then 1,000 came the next year, and then 2,000. Our numbers grew to 20,000. And today what we have now is a well-organized, highly energized grassroots movement made up mostly of university students. Every year there are students from Case Western who go down to Georgia, as they did this last November, to put their feet, along with thousands from around the country, including veterans, nuns, clergy, senior citizens, parents with their children. We gather at the main gate every November to keep alive the memories of Jean Donovan and the other women and the landless farmers and the thousands killed in El Salvador and other countries by graduates of this school. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say our hope is strong. We are hoping that this year in Congress there will be another bill that will be introduced calling for the closing of this school that should not exist. When we're looking for budget cuts, this school is costing the U.S. taxpayer millions of dollars, and every dollar going into this combat school that trains Latin American soldiers, that money is a theft from schools for our children here in Cleveland and elsewhere. And so I would make a plea really to our listeners to call immediately your member of Congress and say, no, not in my name. I don't want you in Washington, our representatives and senators, to be using our money to train soldiers in combat that's causing suffering and oppression to our sisters and brothers in places like El Salvador.
Now, the term that I want to just explore with you or have you clarify is the name of it, the School of the Americas. What does that embrace when you use the word Americas?
They're talking about the Western Hemisphere, countries, the many countries of South America, Central America. It was actually, it began way back in 1945 with a vote in Congress. Let's start up this School of the Americas in Panama. And perhaps I must say the intentions were good. They said we must bring stability to the Americas south of the border. There was a lot of unrest. Marxism was starting to come into some of the countries. And what happened, though, was we, especially in the 60s and 70s and 80s, our country, the United States, began to ally ourselves with these countries' dictators, all in the name of fighting communism. And what happened, we allied ourselves, the United States, with dictators and that small economic elite in these countries that over time had accumulated, who had in their hands the wealth and the power. If you go to these countries today, it's incredible. The vast majority of our sisters and brothers, the children you see, living in shacks. They don't have running water, no lights. Very few have health care. Very few have schools. And there's that small economic elite who run the countries. But I must say today, that's changing. There's a sea change taking place in these countries. We have gone, delegations from the SOA Watch, to 15 countries. Over the last 3 years, we've met with 6 presidents, defense ministers, university students, and countries that have been dominated by our country, the United States, are electing as their presidents people like President Evo Morales in Bolivia, who are more closely allied with the poor, who are talking about using those countries, their countries' resources to improve the quality of life for the poor. And one last thing, they are saying to us that our country is welcome, pero no como antes, not as before, not to come in to exploit the cheap labor and those vast resources there that enrich the United States.
Well, I appreciate all of that, the explanation, because it needed to be explained. When I first learned about School of the Americas, I should say, I thought, what does that embrace? What are we dealing with? I mean, this is a very large movement that you have
School of the Americas sounds really kind of like a nice name there, you know?
Yeah.
Who could be opposed to a school?
Well, it has to be the right kind of school, doesn't it? At least from our standpoint. Well, again, I want to mention the Jean Donovan International Social Justice Conference that's going to be held here at Case Western Reserve University. And the subtitle of it is, and I know that Father Roy his heart will be warmed by this. The subtitle is Repression, Resistance, and Transformation in Central America. You are now moving in another direction, or you have expanded on what you're doing in terms of carrying this message of yours forward. We at Case Western Reserve University have been fortunate in having you. This is a part of what you're doing now. You're moving around among universities where, as you have explained, university students now are becoming a large part of this whole movement. So tell us just a little bit more about that before we have to sign off.
About the struggle.
What you're doing now and the involvement of universities.
When we see an injustice, up close and clearly, we cannot keep quiet. And I just want to invite, I just hope that many, many will come to this forum on Jean Donovan. She has been such an inspiration in my life, in the lives of so many in our movement. She gave her life, as did the other women, for the poor of Latin America. I remember when she was really, her family and friends were concerned about Jean, and the other women got letters from their families. You should maybe think of coming home, because it was so dangerous. But what she said was, how can I leave my people? They are so powerless. They are so voiceless. They are suffering so much. How can I even think of, going home? This is my home now. I found another family.
Yes.
And she knew the consequences, and she paid the price. She gave her life for justice. And in every sense, she's a true martyr in our church, in our world, a prophet. And she continues to inspire us. So, inspired by Jean Donovan and the other women and Bishop Romero and so many others, I continue to speak truth to power. I'm not going to shut up. I'm happy to say that in our movement, there are over 275 people, 19 from the state of Ohio, who have gone to prison for this cause. I've been in prison for a little over 4 years, over the years, protesting nonviolently the training of these soldiers at Fort Benning. And I would just encourage people to look at this issue with critical eyes, to go to our website for more information. I've come to believe that our greatest enemy in the United States is ignorance. We know so little about our country's foreign policy, what we're doing to the people of Afghanistan, what we did in Vietnam, what we're doing to these countries in Latin America, those on the receiving end of our foreign policy, and this school down in Georgia. For more information, I would encourage our listeners to go to our website, SOAW.org. And there's a lot more information. And all I can ask is that we try to live out the words of Bishop Oscar Romero, one of the many killed in El Salvador, when he said, we have a voice, and we can all do something to bring more peace and justice to our world.
Yes. I want to close with this one final question for you. Why were you our best choice to come to celebrate Martin Luther King here at Case Western Reserve University?
Well, I don't know if I was the best choice, but one of the many peacemakers, I think, who have been inspired by Dr. King and others like Rosa Parks and so many in the civil rights movement. But I must, as I said last night, be honest, I was asleep during the civil rights movement. I grew up in this small town in Louisiana, went to segregated public schools. That was the tradition, as they said, And I didn't question it. I didn't question this whole issue, that injustice of racism. And it wasn't until Vietnam, really, that I was in Vietnam again, thinking our cause was noble, that I started hearing about the words of this prophet, this martyr, Dr. King, his message about nonviolence. And I think it was because I was in such a situation of despair and lost hope, began to see for the first time that violence was a dead-end street. And here's this prophet rising from the South saying violence was not the way. If we are going to survive, we must live non-violently. We must love one another. Violence is not the way. And it was, I must say, the beginning of the journey. And it was just the beginning. And Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi, Dorothy Day, and other prophets, they started to really inspire me. I saw, when I would read the words of Dr. King, I had the book by Coretta Scott King,
yes.
his quotes.
Yes.
I was just in awe. Where did this wisdom come from? It was like the divine speaking through a human being. And when we started the School of the Americas Watch, Dr. King was there inspiring us from the very beginning. We realized, as he said, there's got to be more than words. We've got to integrate with our words actions, but non-violent actions.
Yes.
And I must say, we had to deal with our anger. We were so angry, I and others. How can one not be angry to know what happened to the 4 churchwomen? We were so angry after they were raped and killed by the Salvadoran military that we had trained, and so involved in El Salvador, and refused to pull out. And that anger can really become very destructive. It can dominate us. But Dr. King always said we've got to be disciplined. We've got to take that anger and direct it into nonviolent ways. And from the very beginning, when we started the SOA Watch movement, I and others, we said we must, the way we are going to confront U.S. foreign policy in the School of the Americas and close it is through nonviolent direct action. And civil disobedience, like in the civil rights movement, became an integral part of our movement.
Yes.
And, we have over 275 people who have crossed the line, gone to prison. And as I mentioned, I've been in prison for a few years. And whenever I was there, I felt, I sort of said, thank you, Dr. King, for helping me get here. And like Dr. King, he reminded us they can send us to prison, but the truth cannot be silenced. They will not silence us. We wrote hundreds of letters from prison, and when we got out of prison, we went back to work. And so we are grateful for Dr. King, for helping to awaken me, to get me on that road to peace. And so he and other prophets, like the 4 churchwomen, like Jean Donovan, they continue to inspire us on the journey.
It seems to me, if I may say this, I think that Martin Luther King said, I have a dream, and that you have helped fulfill it. Thank you.
You've been listening to Regionally Speaking, a forum that explores the distinctive aspects of Northeast Ohio. Today's program is made possible through the generous support of the Social Justice Alliance Institute, the Case Western Reserve University Advanced Opportunity Grants, and the Case Western Reserve University Center for Community Partnerships. To learn more about the issues facing our region, visit our website at blog.case.edu/WRRS. You can also email your comments, questions, and suggestions to regionallyspeaking@case.edu.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to join us next time for Regionally Speaking.